Attention all squad. Attention all squad. The suspect in the shooting at Elm, Houston is reported to be an unknown white male. Weight 165 pounds. Reported to be armed with what is thought to be a .30 caliber rifle.
Single bullet query.
Hello and welcome to Single Bullet Query, an undergraduate level course on the JFK assassination. Warning, this video contains adult topics and content. It has foul language, discussions, and depictions of graphic violence, so this is not a video for young kids. Also, please see the end of this session for declarations concerning fair use of material. All right, course expectations. This course is not for credit. So you're partaking in this curriculum is with the expectation of self-learning, self-edification, and moving the discussion of the JFK assassination forward as a whole. It's designed as an undergraduate level course with an emphasis on critical thinking, reason argumentation, and cognitive biases. All right, this course provides a kind of structure, an overview of the JFK assassination, exploring a whole spectrum of views from conspiracist to lone gunman. The problem is that much of the time information about the JFK assassination is all over the place, and it's very hard to find one systematic approach to all of it. The goal here is that you'll be able to analyze the key issues of the assassination through the use of argument, counterargument, and critical thinking methods. And that's going to include logic, so identifying the type of arguments being given, studying the types of arguments given, learning to identify the features of arguments, and determining whether or not those arguments are valid or sound, strong, weak, strong or cogent. We'll also review logical fallacies and cognitive biases because those things are so important to the determination of whether or not a claim is true. The topics that we're going to look at here will include governmental investigations, legal aspects of the JFK assassination, some forensic analysis, and of course, expert testimony. We'll also look at the evolution of assassination research from the 19th century from the 19th century. It feels like it's been going on that long. From the 20th century to the 21st century. So we'll look at how the JFK assassination research community started and evolved over time. Similar to the disclaimer about the video at the beginning, I have a disclaimer here about the course itself. Some of our discussions and topics are going to include the use of objectionable language and adult topics because those things are going to be pertinent to the learning process. They'll be part of how we learn about the assassination. So you're going to be exposed to depictions of violence and gore in this particular course, as well as language and ideas that are in conflict with your personal worldview. Quick side note here. This class session is dedicated to best friend of the course, Steve. Steve is really, one of my best friends and certainly my best assassination friend. Steve and I don't agree on the assassination, but we agree that it's really important. And I've never met another person who has been as giving with his time and his insight as Steve has been. And, we text often about the assassination, and I'll often ask him how he thinks about something because it's so frequently helps to inform my own views. And I can see, oh yeah, I didn't take that into account and so forth. And you just, generally speaking, can't find a better human on the planet. Steve is just a fantastic person, and he's given so much over the years to the assassination community. So Steve, this very first class session is dedicated to you, my friend. I hope you are well. All right, class session number 1, course introduction. Let's get right down to it. This is kind of our outline. We're going to do some of this basic stuff, which we've done, the outcomes, so what you can expect about the course, warnings about the course, what it covers. Then we've done the class session dedication, and we're doing our outline right now. We're going to talk about what a conspiracy is today. So we'll talk about legal definition and kind of a philosophical definition, why those definitions matter, as well as the historical prevalence of conspiracies in general. So we kind of dovetail into a third type of definition of conspiracy, sort of. Then we'll talk about cognitive biases and confirmation bias, talk about how we think about the JFK assassination, why it's not, although it may be a conspiracy theory, it's not in the sense that the flat earth is a conspiracy theory. Then we'll talk about why we're doing this and then how we're going to do it. And then I'll discuss the course communication principles. So that's basically how I'm going to communicate things to you. Then we'll do a super fun quiz. You can stick around for that if you want. It's a way to check how you did with regard to the material that we covered in this outline. It's nice, I think, to have a little comprehension check frequently. Rather, I'll watch something or I'll read something and I find it really interesting and engaging, and then I can't remember it the next day because I never check back in to what it is that it's talking about. So we'll do that at the end of every session, and then also we'll do a refresh at the beginning of every session, but because this is the first class session, we won't have that. And then we'll chat a little bit about, I have a killer quote at the end of this, and then we'll preview the next class session, and then we'll close with the fair use declaration that I talked about at the very beginning of that video. All right, so our concepts this session, we're about middle of the road here. We've got 4 concepts that we're going to talk about expressly as I go through the material. I'm going to stop and say, hey, we're talking about this concept really quickly. And what you'll see here is this is a bunch of, these are kind of like our groundwork. These are our cornerstones, the foundational elements of this course. And they're going to help us build understanding together, produce knowledge together. So our very first course concept is going to be conspiracy. All right, so I've brought up the black letter law definition of conspiracy. This is just the online black letter law definition. A conspiracy is an agreement between 2 or more people to commit an illegal act along with an intent to achieve the agreement's goal. Most U.S. jurisdictions also require an overt act toward furthering the agreement. Okay, so why do I bring up the legal definition? Just really quickly, people are interested in whether or not a crime was committed in the assassination of JFK, and so obviously a definition of what that crime would be relevant. This is not the definition for conspiracy in Dallas in the mid 60s, but it's probably pretty close, honestly, because it comes from, they both come from English common law. Now, let's contrast conspiracy in a legal sense with a philosophical definition of conspiracy that comes from Michel Jacques Gagnier's excellent Thinking Critically About the Kennedy Assassination. This is a textbook that is written for a college level course on the assassination. It's an excellent book. It's really very good. Gagnier is a former conspiracist gone anti-conspiracist, and so he has a lot of insights into what he sees as shortcomings to the conspiracist position. My thinking is that if you're a conspiracist, this book would tend to frustrate you, but you'd learn a lot. And if you're not a conspiracist, I think you'd really love it. Okay, so philosophical definition of conspiracy. Here we go. A theory that explains an event or set of circumstances as the result of a secret plot by usually powerful conspirators. Now, this is a much broader definition than we had when we were discussing conspiracy just a moment ago legally. It's going to encompass a lot more instances of events or patterns of facts or constellation of facts than you would have with the first definition. And that's because these have different uses, right? Definitions are always going to be relative to the use that they have. Now, why are we bringing up both? Well, very often people will just say, was there conspiracy to kill JFK? And they don't define what the term is. And there might be a definition in one sense and not in the other. And if one person has one definition in their head and the other person has another, and they claim to disagree about whether or not there was a conspiracy, unless you can establish that they both agree on what a conspiracy is, that exchange is not productive because it's not clear whether or not they're sharing the same terms. Also, it's just generally a good idea to start sharpening and clarifying our use and the meanings of our terms. It also highlights the fact that the assassination itself is a multidisciplinary endeavor. Since the inception of the JFK assassination, people have brought their own areas of expertise to it. So you can see this in things like Accessories After the Fact by Sylvia Marr. It's back there on the shelf. I was just looking at it this morning. And she's a researcher by trade. That was always what she did. And I believe she did it for the UN, and she might have worked somewhere else. I'm not sure. But boy, you can tell. You can tell she knows her citations. She understands how to organize an argument, how to look through vast reams of data. And that's going to be a different approach than if you look at something like, even on the other end of the spectrum, something like Reclaiming History by Bugliosi. That's a book that's definitely written by a prosecutor, and you can see it in how he thinks about evidence, and he thinks about it differently than how Marr does. And it's important to realize that you, in learning about the assassination, are going to bring your own valuable sets of skills and expertise to what's being discussed. So that's kind of what we're thinking about here. A quick side note here on some other things. I covered many of them already. Definitions matter because we want to save time and effort, right? We don't want to argue with somebody for 6 weeks to find out, oh no, we actually agree on what we're saying. It's just we had a dispute about whether or not that's what that word means. Also, sometimes we think we know what words mean and we don't. I don't know how many times in my life somebody said, well, do you mean this or do you mean this? And I think, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it that much. And so we need to always be on guard as to what we think we know, because that's likely where we're going to be making mistakes. Also, we just generally want to be as clear as possible. And yeah, we covered this already. People are always going to have different versions of what happened, and we need to clarify when we're talking about what kind of versions, what kind of thing we think has happened. So clarity. There are sort of three kinds of buckets that I'll refer to generally throughout this course that reflect the different kinds of thinking that you can find within the JFK assassination. These are broad categories, and you could cut it up differently if you want, but we'll start here. The first bucket is that there was no conspiracy. So kind of in response to the question, who killed JFK, this bucket would say one person. On the other end of the spectrum over here, there's the claim that there was a conspiracy to kill JFK. JFK was killed by 2 or more people. And by that, it's going to depend on what we mean by conspiracy. Do we mean a legal definition? Or do we mean something like a philosophical definition? But here, we're just going to say 2 or more folks. And then there's this middle bucket of thought, which is huge in the JFK assassination. Actually, it would be really interesting to compile a map of books and media and positions within the JFK assassination that would be more detailed than this. But this middle ground occupies a huge portion of it, and it's where someone is not necessarily arguing for a conspiracy per se. Instead, what they're doing is they're criticizing the official version of events that the government claims happened. And by that, I mean, usually it's something like the Warren Commission, but it can also be the HSCA that they're attacking, or the Ramsey Clark panel, or blah, 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 blah down the line. So there's kind of three ways you can go. One, there's no conspiracy. Two, there's a conspiracy. And then 1.5 is, look at all the mistakes they made in investigating this. Now, what tends to happen is people try to use, because they are using what they have, criticisms or errors or mistakes found or inconsistencies found in the official versions to then slip into an argument for conspiracy. I don't want to get into that too much yet, but it's enough just to note you've got three big buckets of thought. Now, let's foray into the work of a historian, David Rohn. David Rohn, he's written other books for the JFK assassination. He wrote like a legal dictionary or something, I can't recall, about the JFK assassination. It's very expensive and it's hard to find, so I don't have it. But I do have his Zapruder film, and it's a good book. Anyway, Rohn is a historian by trade, and he's an academic. So this is what he does, like his 9 to 5. And he is trying to, and he tries throughout this book to try and distinguish, the claim that there's a conspiracy to kill JFK from something like, there's a conspiracy to convince people that the earth is flat. We'll get to that a little bit later, but he's concerned about these more salacious, wild, crazy claims that are called conspiracy theories versus a conspiracy within the assassination, because he doesn't want guilt by association. He's very concerned, rightfully so, about people prejudging the case. So he writes, But for those who are well versed in American history, the concept of a conspiracy is a familiar one, in part because it represents a common phenomenon in American society, politics, and law, ranging from the Revolutionary generation through the cabals of the Federalists, the treason of the Confederacy, the theft of public resources by various robber barons, the rise of organized crime, the plunder of savings and loans institutions, and the demise of Enron and WorldCom, and so on. Page 2 of the Zapruder film, University Press of Canvas, 2003. So here we see the work of a historian who is looking into these kinds of concepts that we have, which are the result of, let's put it this way. His basic argument is, look, we all know what a conspiracy is. There are tons of examples of actual conspiracies throughout our history, even the founding of this country, right? And so we shouldn't necessarily think that conspiracy is some wild, crazy thought. This is a good example of how a historian makes an argument. They are providing context for the claim that there's an assassination. And the context is, there have been conspiracies all over the place. Okay. And here, of course, we have, there was a conspiracy to kill Abraham Lincoln and actually wipe out the government of the United States and then allow for the Confederacy to move forward. Okay, next concept. I know that was already one concept. That was already some, not heavy lifting, but we did some work. The next thing we're going to talk about is cognitive bias. And this is a term or a phrase that you've heard more and more recently. And it's a way of thinking that your brain has. So I'm going to read the definition first, and then we're going to elaborate on it. Cognitive bias: a systematic pattern of thinking that is a deviation from rationality that can lead to incorrect judgments and evaluations. Okay, what does that mean? Well, okay. We all have cognitive bias, and by that we mean not just like, oh, you're biased. It's a shortcut that your brain takes, and it likely takes it to conserve calories, and that's because your brain sucks up a lot of calories, and calories are scarce in an environment usually, although not recently for me. And the idea here is that something about biases must have given people an edge because all of our brains have them. And what it likely did was conserve calories. Now, they're kind of strange because we are almost by definition unaware of them. We just don't know that they're there. We do them, and then that's that. But a disciplined critical thinker is going to learn to be aware of those biases and work to eliminate them in their own thinking. It doesn't matter how smart somebody is. It really doesn't matter how smart you are. In fact, the smarter you are, the worse it probably is, because your brain is going to go way more into generating patterns for you to maintain your position rather than revise it on the basis of evidence. But you're just going to have these. And so maybe the way to think about cognitive bias is like the way in which you could be the greatest athlete in the world, but if you don't understand the fundamentals of a game, you will not be as good of a player as somebody else who has a perfect command of those fundamentals. Years ago, I remember a game where a famous football player was having their final game, and they were going up against a rookie wide receiver, and the announcer had said, oh gosh, this will be an interesting game because this veteran is no longer, they don't have the same athleticism that they used to have. Are they going to be able to rely upon their wits and their savvy in order to, keep this player contained, this rookie who was very promising and had all this athletic talent? And what ended up happening was that the receiver, who was the rookie, was playing against this cornerback who was a veteran, and they asked the rookie was held to no catches that game, and they asked the rookie, well, what was it like playing against this future Hall of Famer? And the guy was totally exasperated. He was so through. He said, I've never played a game of football like that. And they said, well, why? What happened? And he said, the whole game that guy was coaching me. Right after the first route I ran, he said to me, hey, I knew at your first step that you were going to run a slant. I could see your hips. They twisted way too quickly, and I knew what you were going to run, so it was nothing to keep you covered. And then every single play, that veteran told that rookie, well, you're doing this wrong. You're doing that wrong. I can tell you're doing this. You can tell you're trying to do that, And it goes to show you that it really doesn't matter how quick or fast you are if you don't know the fundamentals of the mistakes that the body can make. So that's what's important about bias. And importantly, I have the same biases, right? So I'm not some untarnished source. You shouldn't agree with what I say just because I say it. I'm just another source. And you should be on guard for the biases that I have. And I do. I have them for sure in this case. So be ready to disagree with me. And if you agree with me, you think already on the case, you should be even more on guard because you're going to be more likely to accept bad evidence that I say because you already agree with it. Okay, yeah, just a few things. I've kind of gone through this already. You can never get rid of cognitive bias. You can try to guard against it. You can do things to minimize the effects of bias. So you can kind of try to formalize argumentation or focus on formal aspects of an argument. And you can highlight routine forms of reasoning that are fallacious. So they're bad. They make mistakes. And we have to constantly be on alert for prejudging information. It's just something that our brain is going to do. Related to this point, we have confirmation bias. And you're like, what does this have to do with the assassination? Don't worry, it'll make sense. And this will be very, very useful as we move through this course. Trust me. Confirmation bias. Here's a formal definition for us. The tendency for people to accept information that confirms their existing worldviews and to actively reject information that opposes those existing worldviews. So let me give you a famous example of confirmation bias. In 1726, a lady named Mary Toft convinced the king's surgeon and apparently a number of other medical professionals that she gave birth to a rabbit. Now, you might think to yourself, well, this was 1726. Maybe their knowledge of genes or, anatomy was such that they didn't realize that this was physically impossible. I assure you, they knew that this couldn't happen. They'd been around people for many, 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 many years, and they understood incredibly well that humans don't give birth to rabbits and rabbits don't give birth to humans. So, how is it that a group of experts could be so convinced of such an obvious falsehood? Well, it has to do with confirmation bias. They weren't idiots, right? It was early on compared to where we are now, but surgeons had some knowledge of that humans gave birth to humans. They did understand that this was unprecedented. Here's a little reference. You can just look up this article if you'd like for some of the supplementary and more detailed history of the delivery of rabbits. Oops. But let me give you that's missing a slide. Okay, I'll give you the spiel. This really bothers me though because hold on. Oh, okay. I know what's missing. Got it. Okay, sorry about that. Here's what happens. Doctors didn't yet have the same level of biological understanding that we have today. And they understood that there was some relationship that existed between a mother who was having a baby and the delivery of that baby. So, for instance, they understood that if the mother was attacked and hurt, she could lose the baby. They weren't exactly sure as to what that relationship was, and they were often faced with abnormal births that they could not explain. And a famous example of this is Joseph Merrick, the so-called Elephant Man. I'm going to show a picture of it next. Remember, I've already given you some graphic disclaimers. And Joseph Merrick was apparently normal for a period of normal, right? In his, that's a terrible word to use, but he didn't exhibit any anatomical abnormalities for a certain period of time in his life. And then he started to. And doctors were sort of at a loss as to why he looked like that and other people didn't. And the theory was that it must have been something about how his mother carried him, and something must have happened to him while his mother carried him that explained why he looked like that. And the idea was that his mother, while she was pregnant, was knocked over and frightened by an elephant. And as a result of that, the concept of an elephant impressed itself upon the mother. And this is the doctrine of maternal impression. And the idea is that this emotional experience impressed itself upon the child, and that's why he looks somewhat like an elephant. So you could see variations of this. Someone who's born deaf, well, their mother must have been exposed to a loud sound. Or a child who's born blind, well, this must have been the result of a flash of light or something like that. And it's very primitive in its understanding, according to our lights. And of course, our lights are going to seem primitive to future generations. But it makes some sense, right? They knew that there was some relationship between the mother and the baby. They weren't sure exactly what it was. But this doctrine of maternal impression was pretty widespread at the time. So, Merrick always thought that his deformity was the result of his mother being knocked down and scared by an elephant. Back to Mary Toft. What happens here? Well, she begins to talk to doctors, and apparently what she does is she does deliver rabbit parts or parts of a rabbit. Somehow she inserts that and then delivers this rabbit. I don't know exactly how she does this, but she does. And so doctors see it, and rather than say, okay, well, this is a hoax, they believe her. And why they believe her has to do with what she says. She says, well, when I was pregnant, she really got into rabbits, right? She was all about rabbits. Well, what does that mean? Well, she would eat a lot of rabbit. She loved rabbit. It was like her favorite meat. So she would eat rabbit, all the time that she could. She would also go into the yard and play with rabbits for hours and hours and hours, and try to hunt them down. And so you can see how, okay, she's eating a lot of rabbit. She's playing with rabbits. She's obviously thinking about them. And then that results in her giving birth to rabbits. And to the doctors, that would make sense, even if it was an extraordinary case, because that would confirm the doctrine of maternal impressions. So because this event confirmed their belief, they were willing to accept bad evidence as a result of that. That's a great example of confirmation bias, right? It confirms something that you're willing to believe, and so you accept bad evidence. Why? Because you've already prejudged the likelihood that it's true. So you think it's true, so you're going to accept bad evidence for it, or evidence that you would normally be more critical of if you didn't agree with it. Lots and lots and lots and lots of cognitive studies have bore this out. This isn't an isolated thing, and it's one of the great fruits for us as modern thinkers, because we can understand, okay, what do I think happened? We can ask ourselves that and then say, okay, what am I likely to do wrong as I approach this subject? And that will help us, because we'll then become less likely to accept bad evidence for our views, and we'll be more receptive to criticisms of the evidence that we ourselves cite, because we know we're gonna think it's better than it is. Okay. So I kind of flashed through this. So we're going to see lots and lots of examples of confirmation bias and cognitive biases in this course. This is just a place to start. So remember, not all conspiracy theories are false, and not all of them are true. We just have to be willing to have the kind of character to say, I'm going to look at this and just try to determine on the basis of evidence alone, and that evidence includes my prejudgment of the case. Okay, so now this brings us to the very important claim that the JFK assassination is not a flat Earth conspiracy theory. What do I mean by that? Well, the claim that the Earth is flat is wrong. Okay, to the flat earthers out there, I know you're really upset about that. Here's what I mean. We can demonstrate to a flat earther that the Earth is flat. You can do it a number of ways. You can get some poles and measure the shadow cast by the poles. You can take walls and then shine a light through the wall, and the light won't curve. Blah blah blah. You can also take a boat and move that boat onto a lake and hold up a flag, and the flag has horizontal lines, and as the boat moves farther out into the lake, you're going to count a fewer number of lines, and that's because ever so subtly the Earth is curved and we don't notice it. On a more simple basis, when you are higher up, you can see farther, and that's because there's a small curve to the Earth. Also, we know that the Earth is flat on the basis of all of the other things that we know are true about the world. For instance, tectonic plates. Tectonic plates is a relatively recent scientific advancement, but it is essential to understanding planetary formation and planetary propagation and how a planet is formed and maintains itself in regard to the force of gravity. And essential to it is that the Earth is itself a spheroid, right? It has to do with the shape of the Earth and the constitution of the Earth, and the Earth has this core because of the immense pressure that exists down there, and we know this because it's Newtonian physics. And we know that as you drill down, pressure increases, and that's because of gravity. We can calculate the speed of the moon and the Earth by reference to Newtonian mechanics, right? We also know, that the Earth is round because we use that every day. Whoops, easy for me to do. When we're using our phones, right? I mean, we have these geosynchronous, I think that's the type, satellites that orbit the Earth, and those are how we use our cell phones. There's this profound irony in that people are questioning whether or not the Earth is round while requiring the very truth that it is in order to propagate that belief, right? In other words, so many other things that we know about the world which are true would also have to be false suddenly, that we know the Earth is round. Now, that's different from saying I can convince everybody on the Earth that the world is round. I can't do that. And in fact, when you try to push somebody who really believes something, you get the backfire effect, which is that they double down on their belief and it makes it worse. So the problem with flat Earth is that it tends to become non-falsifiable. So there's no way to be wrong. Like, there's no way to check whether or not you're wrong. And there are lots of examples of this. One of them is the final experiment. I won't get into it, but we can demonstrate that the flat Earth is wrong. Okay? The JFK assassination isn't really like that. The JFK assassination is a subject which you can read 20 books on it and have a pretty good understanding of what you think happened, then talk to somebody else who's read 20 different books, and you'll completely disagree on the assassination. And so it's something that well-intentioned, well-informed, intelligent people are going to disagree on, even when they're arguing in good faith. So it's not the sort of thing where you should feel like, oh, why don't you believe me, right? Well, people are just going to disagree about it. That doesn't mean that there's not a fact of the matter, right? I mean, I might think it's 68 degrees Fahrenheit outside. You might think it's 72 degrees Fahrenheit outside. It doesn't follow that there's no temperature out there. It just means we don't agree on it. And disagreement may take a long time to work through. It takes a long time to produce consensus. Sometimes consensus is never reached, but it doesn't mean that we don't try. The JFK case, I think it's probably closer to a cold case. At least that's kind of what I reach for off the top of my head because of, the prevalence of like true crime and interesting crime in our society. It's a case that has a lot of evidence that leads to a lot of inferences, sometimes contrary inferences, and we have to try to sort through it in order to determine what happened. But by all means, it's not a flat Earth thing. And you should never think, well, this person thinks there's a conspiracy, so they're crazy. No. Or this person doesn't think there's a conspiracy, so they're crazy. I know I've seen a number of times people will say online, honestly, I don't even get how somebody thinks that there isn't a conspiracy. When I teach this course, students will frequently say that when we've covered some of the conspiracist arguments. Even one or two, sometimes they'll go, I mean, how could you not think there's a conspiracy after you see that? People often feel this way about the Zapruder film. They just say, I mean, obviously, there's a conspiracy. Josiah Thompson, who's a famous researcher you probably know, wrote 6 Seconds in Dallas. He gives a talk. It's online, Last Second in Dallas, which is his second book. And he says in that, man, the instant I saw the Zapruder film, I'm paraphrasing, I just had no doubt in my mind that there was a second shooter. I knew that he was shot from the front. I had no doubt. And people express something like that when they say, I don't see how you could think there isn't a conspiracy. And to me, what that usually means is, at least this is the way that I take it, your mileage may vary, I'm not as aware of what the counter arguments are, right? Because I understand why people hold positions different than what I do. And if I think it's a slam dunk, I've probably missed something, and it's more likely to be bias, my own bias, than it is something else. Okay. All right. Why are we doing all this? So now we're starting to get towards the almost wrapping up the meta issues, about this course. First and number one, most important thing to me, I want to produce knowledge about the JFK assassination. There are tons of opinions about the JFK assassination. Just go anywhere, go online. Everybody has an opinion. The difference between knowledge and opinion is justification. And what I want to do is enable folks to produce or explain the reasons for thinking the way that they do. Very often, there's just a little speech that people like to give about why they think something. And there's not as much attention paid to how closely these things that I'm saying map onto what I think is true. There's not as quite a tight relationship between argument and evidence, or between evidence and conclusion, or premise and conclusion, as you would like. Number two, the goal of this class, I want students to be able to recall the major elements of the assassination, so the chronology of it. You have to understand it's not just one damn thing after another. This happens when the United States is in this particular historical period. And because it's in this historical period, this is what people at the time are thinking. And because this is what people at the time are thinking, because it's so different than how we're thinking right now, that helps to explain certain actions that they're taking. This affects what people think the most plausible suspects are. It helps to explain how people are acting at the time when they're acting in ways that seem very strange to us. Or maybe we would ascribe a certain motive to it, and that's not really what they're thinking. They're thinking about something else. So it's really important to try and get into what's happening at the time so we can understand the sequence of events and how they relate to one another. And then the third point, which I brought up earlier, we want to learn to integrate the facts about the assassination into our analysis of what happens that demonstrates an understanding of both positions, a conspiracist position and a lone gunman or non-conspiracist, is probably a better way to put it, position, right? It's not just enough to know your side. If you only know your side, you know little of that. So we're going to move past simple declarations and into arguments. And what that allows us to do then is to develop a kind of organic process that we can undergo when we continue to learn about the assassination, and we can learn how to explain our reasoning to other people. And then that's going to benefit everybody else in the discussion, right? A rising tide lifts all ships. Or all boats, whatever. The point is, we want to try and make everyone better. If we can just make even a little bit of difference in one or two thinkers, or, a little bit of difference in every thinker, that's going to make a huge impact overall, because it'll apply to so many different folks, right? One of the central assumptions of this course is that we can produce knowledge about the past. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And I'm going to use this by reference to a couple of cases in a book. But the case is Jack the Ripper. Now, I'm not a ripperologist, so if you're a ripperologist or you're someone who studied the case, I know Robert Groden, who's testified before the HSCA in the 70s, was a ripperologist first, I think. I think it was Groden. And so people are quite detailed about their knowledge of the case. So if I slaughter this, I apologize in advance, but it helps us demonstrate this principle. So, all right, what am I talking about? So, the Jack the Ripper is a famous case from London in 1888, there were a series of murders of sex workers that took place in Whitechapel. And, there, at the time, obviously this was a horrific event that garnered a lot of media and public attention. People were concerned about it. The police devoted substantial resources to it, but it ultimately remained unsolved. And so, as you're probably aware, people come forward every so often with a different suspect or different arguments for a suspect or different evidence for a suspect. I recently read a great book by this bloke here, Stephen Keogh. I don't know how to say it. Keogh? I apologize. I just don't know how to say that. And this is a great book because this individual is a Scotland Yard detective inspector, and his own career paralleled that of an investigator in the Jack the Ripper case. So they both worked Whitechapel. They both started working Whitechapel with regard to, I think they walked a beat first and then they moved into terrorism. Like they both had these parallel views. And when he had retired, he was like, I got to find something to do, but I'm basically a murder specialist. And he found out that the career that this investigator had was like really parallel to his own. And he thought, wow, that's really interesting, and that helped to get him into the case. So, we know things about the way that people are now. We know facts now that they didn't have available to them then. And a great example of this is that we know that in certain cases where you have murders like you did in the Jack the Ripper case, where you have a kind of overkill, you have a severe mutilation and an overkill of the victim, a certain proportion, an abnormal proportion of those perpetrators are married. So people who commit these types of violent crimes that have this hyper-violent overkill to them, the statistics are something like 72 or 74 or 73% of those crimes are committed by people who are married. So males who are married tend to commit those crimes. Now, we know that modernly, empirically, but they didn't know that at the time with Scotland Yard. Well, why does this matter? Well, because, Scotland Yard runs across these terrible mutilations, and they say, this has to be the work of a madman, right? This person has to be like 1 foot into the insane asylum. So they're looking for a madman. And in all likelihood, Jack the Ripper was not a madman. In fact, he was probably married, appeared to them like he was a normal person. And in fact, they probably spoke to Jack the Ripper because they did go building to building, room to room in Whitechapel, the neighborhood of Whitechapel, and they spoke to all the residents there. So the name of Jack the Ripper was probably in the original files. They probably did talk to him because they talked to everybody in Whitechapel trying to determine. And of course, this is like a pre-legible state, meaning a society. Not everybody had a social security number back then. People were kind of transient. People changed their names and their identities when they moved. There was no way to check it, etc., etc. But Seeing Like a State, it's a great book. Check it out. But they knew that more likely than not now, Jack the Ripper was probably a normal person. So from the very beginning, the investigation was on the wrong footing. And so that handicapped those researchers into thinking what they could about the case to try and catch him. The other thing that happens is, and again, I apologize if you're a Ripperologist, something happens in 1959. It's either the MacNaughton document is released or a version of the MacNaughton document is released. I don't recall exactly. And there are writings in the margins. There's annotations in the margins. And one of those writings, one of those annotations includes a description of a suspect that could have committed these murders. And sorry, my dog is right here. And this writing moved the case forward for people because the person who had written this was a substantial person in the case, and this was one of their best suspects, according to him at the time. Now, why does this matter? Well, because then a guy named Martin Fido, who, if memory serves, he was at Yale or something like that, some nice school, and he went through the insane asylum records for the 19th century and found the name or name similar to the name written in the margin of this document. And it didn't solve the JFK, or excuse me, didn't solve JFK either. It didn't solve the Jack the Ripper case, but it's generally agreed that it moved the case forward. It added to researchers' knowledge. It helped to carve out certain suspects versus others. Now, it didn't solve it. There are problems with the information that he finds, but it moved things forward. And so you have here the case in which you have the latter production of documents and the latter production of empirical knowledge, mainly the pathologies of serial killers. Both help to contribute to our understanding of the case, meaning fundamentally we know something that the researchers couldn't have known at the time. Jack the Ripper was probably married, or more likely than married, if that data holds for the 19th century. So we can see why it was hard to find him. Okay, another case where this happens is the Zodiac Killer. I know a bit more about this case, but I don't profess to be as knowledgeable about it as some. So the Zodiac Killer, this is a series of killings that take place in Northern California in the late 60s and then the early 70s. I think Paul Stein is murdered in 70 or 69. Now, he was never caught, but he wrote a bunch of letters to various news outlets and to the police. I think he did send letters to the police, maybe just the newspapers. Anyway, these killings took place, and one of the things that the Zodiac did was he sent ciphers in. And one of these ciphers was solved right away. I think that's the 408. It was solved in a weekend. But other ciphers weren't solved until much, much later. There was one of them solved in 2020. About 50 or 60 years later, in any case. Now, the cipher didn't say anything. It didn't tell us his identity, but it was a break in the case. The other thing that happens is people begin to locate things digitally, and the things that they find digitally end up shedding light on the things that Zodiac was saying in some of his letters. So here's a great example. Zodiac sends a Halloween card to a reporter, Paul Avery. And in the back of this card, he writes this weird pictogram. Paradise slaves, by fire, by gun, by knife, by rope. And, it's a weird thing that he says. It might map onto a series of homicides at the time, which Zodiac is attempting to take credit for. But, nobody really knew much about what he meant here. Well, years later, somebody posts on a message board, I shit you not, hey, look at what I found in Tim Holt number 30 in July, the issue from July of 1952. Look at the notes on this wheel. Death by gun, by knife, by fire, by rope. Wow, look at that. There's this obvious relationship between this and this. So Zodiac had that comic book. Other elements of the Zodiac letters indicate that he might have been into comic books. He often uses the phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." That's a relatively common phrase in old comic books. You'll see this is the Batman speaking, or this is the blah, blah, blah speaking. So, maybe Zodiac collected comic books. And at the time at which he sent this card, this was a very old comic book. And, today it's somewhat common for people to collect comic books. Back then it was not. Comic books were produced and destroyed. And that's why they were so valuable when all of that rage came in, I think, the 90s and the 80s. There are just so few of those old comic books left. So that would help to narrow our suspect pool a bit, or it would make somebody more likely to be a suspect if they were in the habit of collecting comic books, right? Because not many people did it. It's not a slam dunk, but it's a start. Another example, and I think this is on the back of that same comic book. Oh no, another Tim Holt comic book. Zodiac began doing this. He has this in a few places. It's not exactly the same, but he has these weird sort of symbols, right? And it's kind of like, what is he doing? Is he just crazy? Well, he's probably copying these cattle brands. And there's a whole story to be told here about cattle brands. We're not going to get into it. But it's pretty interesting that you have some symbology here borrowed, looks like from here. It could just be an accident, but it is kind of interesting. And then you couple it with the same, comic book, just a different issue. It looks like he was collecting these comic books, or he had them around. Well, this wasn't knowledge that was available to people at the time. It wasn't available until, the 2000s. So they're beginning to learn things about the killer that they couldn't have known at the time because that knowledge wasn't available to them. They just didn't catch it. They couldn't find it. Now, a more radical example of this is a book by Jarrett Kobik, How to Find Zodiac. And the reason why this book is interesting for us is because it uses information that was only available in the 2000s. What do we mean by that? It's a long story, but it's worth it. First of all, I really enjoyed the book. I think it's worth it if you want to take a peek at it. It's worth it getting the printed version of it. He writes 2 books about Zodiac, Motor Spirit and How to Find Zodiac. I'd recommend them both if you're into it, especially if you're into the Zodiac case or you're into true crime. Okay. What does this have to do with anything? Kobik is researching the case because he's writing a book about it, just the crimes, Motor Spirit. And as he's writing it, he happens across a name. And he's like, yeah, interesting, but who cares? And the reason why he comes across this name is he starts showing the letters to one of his friends. And this friend is like a prodigious, promiscuous reader. They read a lot of everything. And the person looks at the letters and goes, it sounds like a zine. It sounds like a weird fanboy zine. Well, that alerts Kobik to zines. And it turns out zines are these things that circulated prior to the internet, where if you were interested in like The Hobbit, then you'd subscribe to a zine that someone made where everybody writes to a certain person about The Hobbit. And then that person compiles all those letters, puts them all together, Xeroxes them, staples them together, and then sends that zine out to people all over the U.S. who are into The Hobbit. So it's a way for people to focus their interests together. And he runs across this name, and he's like, I'm not doing this. Everybody has a Zodiac suspect. I'm not doing it. And then he comes across the name again, and he's like, I'm just going to eliminate this person. And it ends up being the case that as a result of looking at zines, which were only digitized after the millennium passed, because what happened was people would send these zines to various universities and colleges across the country because, of course, it's a way to get people who are interested in those things to look at them, right? If somebody's interested in The Hobbit, well, maybe somebody studying in Colorado is, so I'm going to send my zine out there. What universities began to do was they began to archive digitally those old collections, and you could search them online. Well, he runs into this person, and he develops a suspect who begins to explain or has a relationship to or has an association with all of these elements in the case that previously had been mystifying or weren't otherwise, didn't lead to like suspects. It didn't help us enough to narrow down suspects. And any one of the elements themselves are probably not very interesting, But when you take the conjunction of all of them, it becomes really apparent that he's developed a suspect who explains the scope of all these elements in the crime better than other candidate suspects do, right? So it's not such a big idea that the suspect owns this certain kind of car, but it is interesting that he owns a certain kind of car, and he participated in Ren fairs, and there was a Ren fair being held the day of one of these attacks, within driving distance of one of the attacks, and that would help to explain why he's wearing a certain outfit that day. Also, we know a lot about what this person was reading, and the way he describes a type of bomb that would only be used, that was only available to the masses, the design of it through this particular organization. This has become pretty convoluted. Zodiac talks about an ANFO bomb, ammonium nitrate fuel oil bomb, and the bomb itself is described a certain way by the Minutemen, and it turns out Zodiac describes it the same way, including an error and a precondition for it. So it's significant. Long story short, Kobach finds a new suspect because of all this information that he now has available to him, and that information just wasn't available to researchers prior to the 2000s. Likewise, with the JFK assassination, I think that this could also occur, right? And I get this notion from Bill James, the man from the train. Great book where he catalogs a bunch of killings that take place across the United States. He notes this MO that they all have, and it may be that he's unearthed a serial killer, albeit, 100 plus years after the fact. So he writes, and if you're still with me, good for you. I have long been fascinated by the notion that knowledge can be created about the past. Dinosaurs are the easiest example. For tens of thousands of years, humans had no awareness that the world had once been inhabited by gigantic beasts. Now we know not merely that these animals existed, but we've identified hundreds of species of them. We know what they look like generally and what they ate. We know which type of dinosaur lived where and in what era. We know what happened to them. We have not merely created this knowledge, we have disseminated it so widely across our culture that the average 5-year-old can name a dozen types of dinosaurs and has a collection of little plastic models of them. In my day job, I am a baseball writer. We know many, many things now about the baseball players of the 1950s and the 1960s, about Willie Mays and Bob Gibson and Stan Musial, that those men did not know and could not possibly have known when they were playing. We have pieced together records of their careers that are far more complete than were kept at the time. Modern historians know things about the Romans that the Romans themselves did not know and could not have known. So, that's what I'm trying to do in this course. That's what we're trying to do in this course. We're going to look at later developments in the creation of knowledge, so some critical thinking tools and advances in logic, and we're going to try and use those to help everyone develop better justification for their opinions and try to lift all the sinking ships to elevate the discourse about the JFK assassination. And so this isn't about my opinion on the assassination, right? This is for, hopefully, another generation or someone, just anyone in the future who's interested in the assassination, trying to understand it. Here are some tools, here are some basic elements of the assassination, and in studying this, you'll be further ahead. You won't have to recreate this for yourself. Here, oftentimes people talk about, I've been in the assassination, I've been studying it my whole life, I've been studying it for 40 years. I know Steve has been studying it virtually his whole life. And, people will often say, oh, everything changed when I read this book, or, I read this book and it had a big impact on me. I know that that's true. I once saw a really good talk, and a guy referenced accessories after the fact, and he talked about how that had a big impact on how he thought about the case. So that's what we're trying to do here. In terms of my own opinion on the assassination, I obviously have one, but I don't think it would be particularly novel or informative to you. So my bias will come out, my position will come out, but I'm not here to produce consensus about what people should think about the assassination. I want to help folks develop their own positions about the assassination, right? Okay, how are we going to do this? Usually I will present an argument, then I will present some kind of counter argument, and then it'll be up to you to do an evaluation. Now, often I'll do an evaluation, but you can kind of evaluate my evaluation. And this is the way that positions are produced. It's how you can produce justification. So I advance an argument, and then I find fault with the argument. One of the premises isn't true. The logic is wrong. It's a fallacy, and or it includes some type of employment of an obvious cognitive bias, something along those lines. And then the listener evaluates for themselves. So the way to think about this is, if you disagree with me, good. I'm doing it right. If you learned something about the assassination that you didn't know before, good, I'm doing it right. I'm not here to try to get you to agree with me. There's very little to be done there, right? It doesn't help. Everybody in the world could stand up and agree with me on the assassination tomorrow. It wouldn't help, right? What we want to do is give folks the tools to help evaluate for themselves what they think is true. So let's take something like an argument that people sometimes make. Could Lee Harvey Oswald have actually shot JFK? So there are a number of ways in which this question might be argued for in the positive or the negative. Now, you might say, well, no, he couldn't have shot JFK, so there had to be another shooter, so there was a conspiracy. And one argument that you might give is that there are certain facts about the weapon that Oswald is supposed to have used, and those facts preclude Oswald making all of the shots. And here I'm talking about something like, and I just realized I would rephrase this differently, but it's just an example. The gun cycles and shoots at 2.25 seconds. And shots take place quicker than that, so Oswald couldn't have been the only shooter. Now, in counter to that, you might say, well, that's true, but that figure of 2.25 seconds is one that was propounded by the FBI, and folks come along later and they revise that number. The HSCA says, oh no, that number is actually much smaller. Here's a guy who did it much quicker, and here's why that original figure is incorrect. Okay. And then as the student, you decide between those arguments. Well, I think the FBI is more likely, or no, I think the HSCA figure is wrong because, right? You still have to do the work yourself, and then you evaluate which you think wins. Another example, could Oswald have shot JFK? Could only Oswald, I should have put could only have Oswald shot JFK. Witnesses hear shots from more than one location, right? So no, there were shots from more than one location, so only Oswald could have shot JFK. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put in here, could LHO alone? There. And of course, this messes up all the formatting. There. All right. I fixed it. Could Oswald have shot alone? No, because we hear shots from more than one location. That's an argument that folks often make. It's made very early on. We'll do a whole segment on the grassy knoll. And the counter argument to that is, yes, people heard shots from one location, but eyewitness testimony is fallible. It's often subject to error. Classic example would be something like the Titanic. This gets pointed out by Case Closed. Half of the people who saw the Titanic sink thought that it broke in half first, and the other half thought it sunk in one piece. You know, in retrospect, it seems bizarre that you wouldn't notice something like that, or that you might miss it. Like, how could you miss it? You're out there in the ocean, you're watching this thing go down. You know, it seems pretty terrible that you couldn't notice that. You couldn't know that. So it looks like we can't rely on that eyewitness testimony alone. So maybe you conclude, well, we need to have the most reliable data we can to make that inference, right? But then there's always going to be a counter to each one of these things. So the counter to that is, well, I'm not suggesting that the eyewitness testimony alone is the way to do this. Or you'd say something like, yes, but it's not just that one or two people see it, it's that a number of people see it, right? Nothing is ever finished. There's always going to be a further iteration. Your brain is always going to come up with some other objection that I cannot foresee. And that's the point, right? The point here is not that you watch this video and go, I agree with everything. All right. Coarse communication. This is an important concept. I'm only going to bring this up once, but I'm going to cover each one of them. Truthfulness. To the best of my knowledge, what I'm telling you is true. All of my claims here on this channel are subject to revision. So I make something, a presentation, and then I would change it when I'm done. I'd go, oh no, I would have done that different. Or I learned something new in the middle of making it, and I would do the whole thing differently again. So I'm always revising things that I think, and so I will always give you what I think is true. I'm not self-delusional. I think that these things are true when I tell you that. Also, I may occasionally adopt a position only to later rebut it. So some positions, you could never know, right? I may say something and you go, oh, it sounds really good. And then later on I rebut it. So you shouldn't take any one thing as I say as gospel. Next, authenticity. I'm independent. I'm not being paid by anybody to do this, right? This is, in contrast to an attorney's role where the attorney is the only thing standing between a defendant and sentencing or conviction. And in those cases, I would have to argue and do everything I could to fight for my client. I'm not an agent of some other entity. This is just me up here, right? I'm the only one who's doing this. No one's paying me to do it. Respect. I do my best to treat you and all the positions in this debate with dignity. My goal here isn't to achieve fame or notoriety or power or profit. I mean, even the most successful JFK stuff in today's day is not anything that's like, you could not in any sense retire. I know somebody who wrote a great book about the assassination, been around the assassination community a lot longer than I have, killer book, and they really haven't made anything off of it. And my goal here is not profit or fame. I mean, I'd be lucky to get a couple dozen views. And I mean that. I don't have any illusions about that. I'm just here to try and provide people tools that will help them deliberate about the assassination. And that's a really, really small market, right? And I get that. So I'm just here to produce knowledge and truth. That much being said, I've got my own opinion, my own bias. It's going to come out. Equity. I'll be fair here. I'm not going to try to manipulate your fears about, actors in the debate or someone being killed, right? You're going to be killed because of this. I won't try to manipulate your aims or desires to convince you that something is true. And then also social responsibility. I'm just here to try and help the JFK community. Part of what that means is I will have a position on the assassination, and my goal there is to, is to help the community in general. I'm not here for any other reason, right? Except the only caveat there is the will of coffee. And coffee is a very strong, I think we all know the power of coffee and its necessity in our daily lives. And nobody would even begin to think for a second that they could be independent from coffee and its reach. It's just not possible. Okay, so you've made it this far. I don't even know how far in we are, but it's far. And we are now going to take a quiz. And this quiz is going to cover some of what we discussed in this case and the way in this class session. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask these questions and it'll give you a quick comprehension check. And then the beginning of the next class session, we'll also do another review. And then I kind of trail these through the course, right? They're like breadcrumbs that you stagger through the course, and I'll come back to something that I talked about a couple sessions ago, because maybe it's going to come up again. And then I want that to be there, or I just want to refresh it. It's called, well, that's not generative learning, but you get really close to forgetting about something and then you boom, re-up it, and that strengthens those neurons and it makes it your learning more durable. So here we go. All that to say quiz. All right. True or false? This course is a money-making enterprise for the hosts. And I say hosts because I have a friend who's going to help me with this case, and I'll have other folks on who are experts in different things, and they'll be on. So this course is a money-making enterprise. False, right? There's no demand for this commercially. I am not making anyone pay for this course. There's thousands and thousands of hours of free labor, and it's worth every penny. Okay, so no, I'm not here to make money. This comes up often, and we'll talk about it more in detail later, but you always have to question someone's motive. You know, you have to evaluate a source and determine whether or not you think they're doing this for the right reasons. It's a fair question to ask. We'll get into that later. All right, next up. Number 2, why do students have to be aware of confirmation bias in studying the JFK assassination? A, Jack London's house party. B, because the JFK assassination is likely a crazy theory, like the flat earth, and people we discuss it with are not worth our time. C, because not believing in the JFK assassination is a crazy theory, like the flat earth, and the people we discuss it with are not worth our time. Sorry about the grammar on that one, on B and C. D, because our brains are likely to prejudge whether or not there was a conspiracy before we see the evidence, we need to be aware of that. And the answer, everybody, D, right? We need to know what confirmation bias is because we're going to do it. It's going to cause us to accept bad evidence, and as a result, we'll be less likely to arrive at the truth. Doesn't matter how smart you are. Okay, number 3, which of the following is not a goal for this course? A, to produce knowledge about the JFK assassination. B, enable learners to recall major chronological elements in the assassination. C, finally get people to agree with hosts about the nature of the assassination. Or D, learners will integrate historical facts into analysis which demonstrates understanding of both conspiracist and lone gunman positions on major evidentiary issues concerning the assassination. Everybody, C. I am not here. That's driving me nuts. Finally, right? I'm not here to get people to agree with me about the nature of the assassination. I can't do that. If you look at the psychological data, you cannot force people to do that, right? I cannot force you. I am really getting upset here. I get it. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put you on mute because I got to finish this. Sorry, that's frustrating. I cannot force you to adopt a certain opinion. And if I try to do that, then you are going to go the opposite way. It just doesn't work. It doesn't make people learn. People learn on their own, and it doesn't matter to me what your opinion is. Like, I really don't care in that way. I don't. I care that you have reasons for thinking the way that you do. That's what's most important here. It's not whether or not you think the way that I do, because if history is any guide, I'm not some paragon of truth, right? I learn by error. I just do. And I'm hopeful that I begin to learn more as a result of learning about my errors. All right. So I'm expecting to inform and elevate, not confuse and propound. So make up your own mind, not just because I say that, right? Number 4. True or false? With study, confirmation bias can be eliminated completely. False, right? You can never eliminate bias. So you shouldn't think, oh, he doesn't have an agenda. My brain does. So you should never think of me as an unbiased source. I'll do my best, but I'm not, the world just doesn't work like that. You always have to look for bias. You always have to look for ways in which sources can be wrong, because if you don't, then you are what you eat. And if you eat garbage, then it doesn't matter how great you are, you're going to come up with garbage. That's the example of cognitive bias and that athlete, right? Unless that athlete learns the fundamentals of the game the way that the veteran did, they'll never be great. And the same thing is true of the brain. Unless you become aware of confirmation bias and how to mitigate it, it doesn't matter how smart you are. In fact, it's harder because you're more likely to convince yourself of a falsehood. Okay, end of the presentation here. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. That's from Fritz Nietzsche. An absolute truthhood, right? That's spot on, and it's a forerunner of modern psychology, and definitely something that was revolutionary for its time. Okay. Next up, class session number 2 is going to be 10 reasons people think JFK was assassinated by a conspiracy. There are a lot more than 10, and that's no joke, probably hundreds. But certainly we'll cover the top 10, and I'm not saying these are the best top 10, and I'm not saying they're the worst. I'm just saying they're the 10 most frequently encountered, that I've encountered. Okay, declaration regarding fair use. So if you are still listening, you can turn it off unless you want to listen to the fair use bit. The preceding material is provided for educational and informational purposes only. It is not monetized, and its use is strictly for pedagogical purposes without any commercial application or remuneration of any kind whatsoever. As such, any use of copyrighted material herein constitutes fair use as defined under Section 107 of the U.S. Copyright Act and relevant case law. This use meets the following fair use criteria. 1. Purpose and character of the use. The material is used exclusively for non-commercial, educational purposes, including learning, analysis, research, commentary, and scholarship. It is transformative in nature, meaning it adds new meaning, value, or context, rather than merely replicating the original work. 2. Nature of the copyrighted work. Any copyrighted material used comes from published works and is employed in a way that promotes education and critical engagement, rather than simply copying creative or unpublished content. 3. Amount and substantiality of the portion used. Only the amount necessary for educational and analytical purposes is included. No excessive or unnecessary portions of the original work are used, and efforts are made to avoid reproducing the heart of the work. 4. Effect on the market value of the original work. The use of copyrighted material does not replace or compete with the original work in any market, nor does it negatively impact its value or potential sales. If you are a copyright holder and believe that any content does not meet the criteria for fair use, please contact us at singlebulletquery@gmail.com to discuss an appropriate resolution.